I'm Scott Allen Miller, and this is my everyday life living in Leon, Nicaragua. Today I was watching TikTok or something like that and got this really interesting financial analysis of the difference between the boomer generation and current economics in the United States, and explaining why the older generations have a tendency to see the younger generations as wasting their money on Starbucks coffee, for example, and why this isn't actually true. And I think that this discussion, one, is just valuable and interesting on its own, but I think it also plays into an understanding of what life will be like or how you can think about living in Nicaragua, because Nicaraguan living actually takes you back to another era in some ways as far as how the balance of economics are. So I want to talk about that. I really thought this was just a really eye-opening way of looking at something we probably all know but never really think about in this discrete way. So we're going to jump into that right after the bump. It is an absolutely gorgeous day here in the garden. We were nice and cool this morning. It's still very cool. Like, it's almost chilly. You kind of want to put pants on. I got my thick hat on. The dogs are having fun running around. People had blankets on while we were out in our morning meeting. So it's just gorgeous today. Well, we got a lot of nice sunlight, and the trees are it's just a great time of year here. We had some rain recently. My feet are actually a little bit wet, and it didn't rain yesterday, so it's still wet from 2 days ago. Unfortunately, the dogs are anytime I'm out, they've learned that this is the time to bark and do things. So everybody comes out and makes noise because they love having me out here. So the thing that I saw in the video today, this is really interesting. So we all know the younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, they spend so much money on coffee. If they just stopped going to Starbucks, then they would be able to buy a house, for example, or a Ferrari. And of course, none of that's true. That's a really silly thing, but it does feel that way. But there's a reason for that. When I was a kid, and especially when my parents were young, and a television is a really great example. When my parents were young, newly married in their early 20s and had, early careers, they were out of college, but they were with a good job as a junior engineer, my father was able to provide a life where they were able to have a decent apartment and pretty quickly get a house. They were able to go out to eat and buy food without having to worry about starving. They really were not living in a subsistence way. They were doing decently well. They were not wealthy, but they were completely comfortable with those survival items. But however, going out and buying, and this is a great example because my father and I were just having a discussion about this, buying a television was quite a big deal. In fact, their first TV was probably an 11 or a 13-inch black and white little thing, really heavy. And the person they bought it from actually felt badly for them and drove it to their apartment because it was so heavy and they didn't have a way to get it there. Cars were super inefficient. They were dangerous. People tended to only own one. You wouldn't have lots of them. It was a different world. Today, an early career engineer. Now, I went into engineering 20 plus years ago, 28 years ago or so. And in that era, things were starting to shift, but it was in the middle ground. Now they've shifted dramatically to the point where if you were to go out and get an apartment today, even if you're an engineer and you have a decent career, in those early decade of your life, you may really struggle to get past a relatively basic apartment, although it is worth noting that apartments typically are much nicer today. They're better appointed and they're just more comfortable and more functional, and that's part of this overall discussion. But feeding yourself would be quite difficult. Of course, you wouldn't starve, but the cost of food, and especially the cost of going out to eat, would be really large percentages of your income compared to my parents' generation. But if you want to go buy a television today, and we're not talking about some terrible, awful thing. We're talking about a decent size. We're talking about works pretty well. We're talking 4K, bright colors, maybe that it handles 10-bit high dynamic range, easy to use, might have a built-in computer that lets you stream a bunch of services, probably lets you plug in a bunch of things. You can use it as a computer monitor. When my parents were buying those TVs back in that era, it would be normal to spend about $500 on a television. That would be the equivalent of several $1,000s today. Now, they would have been buying that in the 1960s, but if you do the conversion from, say, the 1970s, which I know a little bit better, it's about 4 times. It'd be around probably $2,500 to $3,000 probably less than 3, but certainly in that ballpark is how much in today's money my parents would have needed to have saved up to spend on that first really terrible television. And importantly, that television delivered some pretty awful programming at the time. It did get better in the 1970s, but when my parents were watching Three's Company, it was mostly in black and white and on a screen this big. When I watch Three's Company with my daughter, it's on a giant screen and in color. So even the material and media from their lifetimes is much improved when viewed in mine, which is really interesting. But when today, if I want to go out and get a television for my kids, right, to use, we can get one from Walmart or on Amazon for around $100. And if we go up to $200, we get a big selection of them. That's $200 in today's money. That means buying a television is somewhere between 1/30th and 1/10th the cost of a television all those years ago. But today they're light and big and bright, and you can sit close to them without damaging your eyes. They work really well. They last a really long time. The televisions from my parents' era were unhealthy to use, used tons of electricity, and they wore out, and they just did a terrible job. The gap, not only in the technology improvements, but the cost to get what we consider a kind of baseline. A baseline TV back then was about $500, $490, right? And today, $100. And so if you compare that to the rents, if we go back and look at Three's Company as an example, if you were to get a television like you would have purchased at that time, which I remember TVs being purchased at the era that Three's Company was coming out, and that's older than we're talking about, a television would have cost months of rent, maybe 2 months rent, maybe 3 months rent, but definitely more than one. And today, a normal rent in the United States, an average rent is $2,000 a month. So again, 1/20th of a month's rent could buy you a TV. Coffee, similarly, has not gone up in price nearly as dramatically as the cost of general food or of housing. Because of this, what we've seen is a flip in my parents' generation, to some degree in my generation, and certainly in generations prior to my parents. The bulk of our spending went to luxury items, or it would go to luxury items. Luxury items were super expensive, and base items, houses and homes, shelter, homes, healthcare, those things were affordable. Most people could afford them pretty easily. But when you wanted to start having luxury items, televisions, an extra car, flights to different places, coffee, going out to restaurants, those things were luxuries. They had a very high cost premium. These factors have flipped. In this world, we're able to get an unlimited amount of appliances for the kitchen and televisions and computers. Even when I was a kid, now of course computers are a newer item. When I was a child, computers in today's money worth many thousands of dollars, and they were huge and bulky, and they couldn't get on the internet, and they had basically no functionality. They did nothing, yet were crazy expensive. Today I have supercomputer. We always like to say this. I have a supercomputer in my pocket. The amount of power that we carry in our pockets for less than $1,000 is insane. And if you want to put a good computer on your desktop, we can get computers that are worlds, literally worlds beyond, or figuratively as it actually is, but extremely figuratively, worlds beyond what was available when I was a child. We can do so for $40, right? And that literally $40 is enough to buy what would be considered like the equivalent of all computers in the world when I was a kid, merged together into one. We can get really decent video game. We can get decent laptops for $350. We can get video game platforms for $600, right? And so the gap in cost and the gap in functionality are so dramatic that many of us have lost touch with the fact that we can go out and buy a million things that make our lives easier, to make things more comfortable. Furniture is a fraction of the cost. Even when I bought my first set of furniture, which was well into this conversion era, I dropped over $3,000 in actual money at the time, which is worth like $8,000 to $10,000 today to get that furniture. But the last time my wife and I went out in the US and bought ourselves a nice couch, which was still 10 years ago, maybe more, but my children were both there for it. But my youngest was so young, she doesn't really remember it. We only spent $1,000 to get a probably just as nice couch. Now, nothing super fancy. That's definitely a bargain couch. But I spent nearly $10,000 for more or less the same thing when I was young And now that I'm older, I only have to spend 1/10 as much. And a lot of people experience similar numbers. That might be a dramatic number, but the the factor is still there. Every little thing in our lives is so much cheaper now, except for the basics. So in America, especially, housing and food have skyrocketed in cost, but all those luxuries have become really cheap. And because of this, we see young people today, Gen Zers and younger millennials, and they go out and they will spend money on a lot of these luxuries. And from our perspective, and especially my parents' perspective, looking at that seems weird. Wow, they're going out and they're doing all these things that we could never afford to do. And it's important for both sides to understand, right? I'm Gen X, so I sit in the middle. I can see both perspectives because I grew up in one and live in the other. But coming from that older generation, all of those things are things they didn't get to have. They couldn't afford to do those things. They can't afford those luxuries. A second TV, a third TV, a big screen TV. Big screen TV meant, 21 inches and larger, and meant unbelievable affluence when I was a kid. Today it means you saved up for half a day and went out to the store and got it on sale. Maybe you got it on Christmas special. Maybe a friend of yours gave you their old one. Literally, we give away things that are worth more than all possessions we owned combined just a generation ago. It's a very, very different world. So this older generation perceives this incredible waste of money buying things that people don't need, but forget that those things cost almost nothing and represent the only real comfort that a lot of people are able to afford, because no matter how much of that they buy, they're not significantly impacting. I mean, at some point they do, but they're not significantly impacting their ability to pay rent or their ability to buy food. Those things are such large numbers that they're not moving the needle by not drinking a coffee every day. And someone pointed out that just a few generations ago, you could pay your rent off of 3 cups of Starbucks a day. But today, the most expensive Starbucks item on the menu, you would have to drink 10 a day, 7 days a week in order to pay or make it equivalent to a normal rent, which would be an absurd amount of Starbucks coffee. Like, nobody's actually going to drink that much. Even 3 a day, it's really pushing it. And today, very few people get more than 1, and very few people would go more than a few times a week. Like, the reality of what people are complaining about is a tiny drop in the bucket, whereas had the same behavior been done 40, 50 years ago, yes, it may have paid, maybe not your whole rent, but a significant portion of it, maybe a third or a half of your rent. So that perspective has flipped a lot, and they don't often realize that the rents and the food are so significant. And it's just a change in some of these factors. And in many ways, people have it much better now. That's something to understand, that the quality of the things that we get and what we accept as a base home, for example, has changed a lot. When my parents were children, yes, they were able to easily afford a home. But the thing that they had as a home wouldn't pass standard code today. No one would pay anything for it. They're basically made out of matchsticks and paper. Right? I remember the first home that we ever owned, and we bought this in 1976, but the house was built, and I'm guessing, about 1910, and it was complete garbage. We only owned it for about 7 years before the house started actually falling down. We had to abandon it and eventually burned it, not in a giant house fire. We actually fed the house through its own fireplace until there was nothing but ash, buried the ash in the old basement and covered it up with dirt, and then spent the rest of our lives living with the carcass of our old house just outside the windows of our new house, which was built to modern standards and still seems new today, even though it's significantly along the path of being as old as the house that we buried. So at least over half the age that it was at the time that we burned it down. So the world has changed in such a way that the standards that people are willing to accept today, and this is why it's important for both generations to understand. The older generation is looking at the younger generation and saying, well, they're spending all this money so frivolously, and the younger generation is looking at the older generation and saying they got houses and food basically for free, and they got to spend all their money on luxuries. And that was, both are kind of true, but what they're missing is that today, one, the quality of the things that you will accept or are allowed to get for housing are worlds beyond what most people were able to get in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s. And by the 60s, that was starting to shift. But that quality of houses back then, no one wants them today. They're generally worthless. And some exceptions, but in general, there's not that many of those old houses when people had affordable houses back then. They were not good, right? And they were not comfortable, and they didn't have air conditioning, and they didn't have, grounded electric. Some didn't have electric. They didn't have hookups for internet. They didn't have all kinds of things because we didn't have those things, right? And from the other perspective, right? Well, we didn't get all these extra luxuries. Well, now they do, right? The world has changed, and understanding these ratios of what things cost helps to explain a lot of the changes in lifestyles and perceptions between the generations. So, in reality, I feel that my generation, while we are the poorest generation, I'm Gen X, right? Boomers had more wealth accumulated than we do, and millennials are the richest generation recorded in American history. We fall into the poor middle ground. But even as a poor Gen Xer, I perceive my generation as, honestly, we have a lot more than my parents did. My parents did okay. The boomers did all right. They had a lot of wealth stored, but they spent a lot of their lives living in conditions we would not be super thrilled with. And I lived in those conditions when I was young. My first apartment was okay, but it was not great. Not as good as what people today would generally be happy with. We had different standards back then, and today people have they struggle much more to pay their bills. They work much harder, but the things that they get for it are, in many cases, much better. So I feel that the luxuries of life that I was able to get exceed what my parents were able to get at similar income levels when compared, right? It's difficult to compare. There's so many different factors and we have utterly different lifestyles. But of my generation, people who are working similar jobs, similar positions in life are living much, much more luxurious than their parents did. The difference is we tend to do a lot more. The boomer generation was very much a come home, sit at home and watch TV generation. Now, part of that was because it was very economical to do so. Our generation is much more able to go out and live lives outside of the home because that is more affordable for us. And we're able to buy a lot more things. My parents weren't able to buy a lot of things around the house. Now, all of that comes to moving to Nicaragua. You start to see that the economics shift back to something from a long time ago. It's much more like the 1940s here, in that we have this much lower cost of living. And this is important to point out. The things that cost a lot in the U.S. today for this generation are things we consider part of cost of living, and the things that are cheap are the things that we consider luxury. That's an important terminology that we need to have now. Here in Nicaragua, the cost of living is extremely low. It's like going to the United States in the 1940s, 1950s. In many cases, you're not getting the modern, really luxurious type of housing that a lot of Americans expect. So that's something that you need to be aware of, that those things are different here. Homes here tend to be a lot more basic. They tend to be much smaller. They don't have all the luxuries that we're used to in the United States. In many cases, often they're not designed for air conditioning, and that's something you'd have to add later. And there are some things that are more advanced because we skipped some transitional phases in America. For example, the United States is starting in limited fashion to move away from central air because it's not very efficient and it can cost a lot of extra money. We're trying to reduce power. People are more conscientious of that. Here in Nicaragua, we never built central air systems, so those per room air conditioning units that work much more efficiently are already what people tend to use in those cases where they do use air conditioning. This is much like how the United States jumped to trains first before any other country. There was a lot of learning curve on how to put in trains, and the U.S. did decently well considering how little anyone had experience with it. But Europe was able to come through just a few years later, learn from the American model and improve on it and have a better layout generally of their train tracks in Europe because they weren't learning as they went. They were observing mistakes and learning from good patterns in America and were able to do it better themselves. Nicaragua, in some cases, is in the same boat. We were able to avoid central air, central hot water, and all that extra plumbing that goes into that. Now, in some cases, we wish we had hot water, but central hot water is not the path to that in most cases, right? So while some things are lacking, the ability to do it better is often there simply because we didn't go down those paths and so forth. Things like that can be a pretty big deal. So, and now Nicaraguan homes are not made out of the paper mache that the early American homes were made out of. That, luckily, is not a thing here. Things tend to be very strong, made out of concrete and rock and bricks and such. But in general, you're looking at a more basic lifestyle. And thinking about America in, say, the 1950s is a good way to picture that you're getting a more basic home life. And food here tends to be a little bit more basic than in America, and lower variety. And And that if you go back to food in the United States in the 1950s, well, it was very similar. Yes, a different flavor profile, but the effect of what made it cost less was also there. The United States has changed a lot in the last few decades in ways that are somewhat unique to the United States. And so coming to Nicaragua, some of those things are going to change. And I think most people know that, but that plays into partially why the cost of living is so much lower. If you want to completely replicate an American home here, it is still far cheaper than being in the United States. That more or less goes without saying, but it is much more expensive than living a Nicaraguan lifestyle there, which is just important to point out. If you want to replicate the way that Americans do things today, some of the cost that comes with the American cost of living is created by what Americans demand for that cost of living, because that preference, that allowance of what we'll accept has changed since my parents' time, since my childhood. Right? I had friends who grew up in homes that would never be considered acceptable today, and it was completely normal at the time. In my own, when I was very young, would never be accepted. No one would ever pay for that today. If someone bought that, it would be for destruction because they want to get the land, which is fine. But that's how it would be treated today. So those things have changed. That's important to understand. Here in Nicaragua, though, and this is where things get powerful. If you're shopping locally, you typically have the same effect that you had to some degree in the United States in the 50s and 60s and 70s, given that luxury items are going to be a cost premium, whereas the cost of living is quite low. However, where things are different is that the cost of luxury items, which are normally things that can be shipped, are really low in places like the United States and China. So while you live in Nicaragua and locally those things are quite expensive, in most cases, not always, you're often, not always, able to ship them in from those other locations very easily. And so we actually, in most cases, have access to kind of the best of both worlds. We have the low cost of living of Nicaraguan general cost, and then we have, if you can adapt and live in Nicaraguan style housing, in Nicaraguan communities, with Nicaraguan materials and designs, then you're often going, and especially if you're willing to eat the food, then you're going to have this really low cost of living option that doesn't exist in America, for lots of reasons, both cultural and just the cost of materials and labor. But you don't necessarily have to give up the luxuries, or a lot of them, because we have such easy ways to get them here, such as by having them shipped by maritime. So Amazon will go directly to a maritime shipper and come directly here. Sure, we have some delays, but we're able to get those things. This helps to explain why modern Nicaragua is the way it is and why the cost of living seems so impossible to Americans. It doesn't give you complete every piece of the picture as to why it's able to maintain this. But when looking at America's economy and how the luxury and cost of living items have flipped as to the amount of money that they actually take to acquire, is super interesting in understanding that effectively that flip didn't happen in Nicaragua. And so that is a large portion of why things are the way that they are, both as a culture and society. Like, why do people live this way? That helps to explain it. It's kind of a throwback to how Americans used to live. And also, why are the costs this way? Because this is the thing that they're doing, and it helps create that cost. Plus, everything's just cheaper here. That kind of goes without saying. Cost of living is a thing that is heavily impacted by where you live. Luxury items tend to be far less impacted by where you live, because luxury items can be shipped, but cost of living cannot. One is tied to the locality. One is influenced by the locality, but not tied directly to it. So that is a lot of why. Now, of course, Nicaraguans, this is just worth noting, also have a culture of not buying a lot of luxury items. Traditionally, luxury items were financially out of reach, and still it's an expenditure that you don't need to make if you are living at very much subsistence level, and your cost of living, while very low in Nicaragua, is for most Nicaraguans a significant portion of their finances, right? Their rent and their food are a large percentage of their income for the average Nicaraguan. So even though luxury items are in theory quite affordable, very similar to the United States, if you put in the effort and know what to do, that is still quite expensive. That $100 TV could still be more than your rent, right? There's places that we've seen for rent relatively recently in Managua, just tiny places, for about $84. Well, are you going to spend $100 on a TV that's this big to go in an apartment that would be the entire wall? Maybe. But if you're in a place where you're only spending $84, spending $100 on a TV is a lot of your income, most likely, So those things are still kind of out of reach. And we don't typically get the super cheap televisions here. Normally we're going to pay a bit of a premium on that. So it'd be more like 200. Well, 200 compared to 84 could be almost 3 months rent. That's something you really notice. I guess it's more like 2.5, but you get the point. So those factors remain here, that there isn't a lot of discretionary luxury expenditures in most cases. But when there is, yeah, things remain quite accessible and inexpensive if you know what you're doing. So because of that change in lifestyle, even those of us who are not Nicaraguan, who have moved here, we are influenced by the people around us and the idea of keeping up to the Joneses, seeing other people buy stuff all the time. And these are, believe it or not, just really powerful factors in America as to why Americans go out and buy so many things. Well, I saw so-and-so using this. It seemed really cool. Their home life is so much easier because they have this thing that automatically makes dinner for them, right? I have a robot that cleans the house. Those are not things you necessarily need, but when you see other people have them and it's a common thing, you're like, well, I'll spend money on that. I'm not saying those are bad things. Those are absolutely smart things, right, to have. I've had a robot that cleaned our floors before. It was fantastic. I do wish we had one here. Maybe that's a good idea. We could actually get one. I don't know why I never thought of that. And it would be really handy to just constantly keep the floors clean because we get dusty here, and that's my number one complaint. It's just the dust that blows in because we have the windows open all the time. And So because no one else is doing it, and because houses aren't designed to be filled with things, because our spaces are smaller, we don't feel that vacuum that we need to fill, whether it's the vacuum in our emotional space or the vacuum in our physical space. We don't have to go out and buy things to make it look like it's occupied. We just get smaller, more practical places and spend more time using the things that we have or going outside the house. I thought this would be an interesting discussion because it's always important to kind of grab that context. And in this case, I think it's more interesting as just a look at American life and why people perceive things so differently today. And I want to throw this in at the end. When I was young, like when I was a child, university was a really important part of education because the knowledge that you needed to do things was walled up in the universities. And if you didn't pay university to give you that knowledge, you generally didn't have access to it. Of course, we still had Nepo babies who were able to go to their parents in every field, right? Not a California thing, and say, oh, my parents work in banking, so they teach me about banking, so I can go work in banking. That still existed. But if you wanted to work outside of a field that your parents had really intimate knowledge and access to, you had to go to university. You had to pay for someone who had had experience in that field, who kept it walled up to give you that knowledge, to give you that training, to give you that access, to even explain what the field was like in most cases. That is the childhood that I had. But by the time I was in my later college years, the internet had taken over, and now universities actually are a barrier to education. There's far more knowledge in 99.9% of cases on the internet, often for free, that is widely available and accessible to you even as a child. You don't need to be college age or pay to get into college, and even many university classes are now free online. So the access to the knowledge necessary to work in most fields is completely open, and it's actually not just a little, far easier to gain that knowledge quicker and cheaper without going to university. So that is a cost of living that existed as a barrier to careers for generations prior to mine, and mine is a transition, and generations after mine do not have that barrier. They don't have to go to university. University stands between them. And the numbers hold this up. The United States government has always published numbers showing just how not effective university is for getting people into better careers. But certainly in my childhood, you had to. It was the only way to come up with high earnings. And so the only reasonable way. There's the rare exception. And so that's another place where things that we perceived as relatively cheap but necessary, university was cheaper for my parents than it would be for my kids on average. But for my parents, it was essentially mandatory to do the kinds of jobs they want to do. And for me, it was beneficial but not mandatory. And for my kids, it's not even beneficial. It would directly oppose their goals. And so those kinds of shifts in the economy play out in lots of different ways and show which things were necessities that now are luxuries that have shifted from being part of the cost of living equation that we often overlook into part of the luxury equation today. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. All the details are down in the show notes, as well as a link to join our WhatsApp community here in Nicaragua, the Nicaragua Expats WhatsApp community. It's a great place to jump in and talk to lots of other expats. It's quite a lively group, actually. already in that's just opened on the first day that WhatsApp had groups. And of course, ask questions here on the show. Send in video questions to me. All the ways to contact me, to send things in, everything's in the show notes. You can get all kinds of information there. I encourage you to go down and take a look at that, and go down and at least say hello, if nothing else. Leave your comments. Definitely ask your questions. It's your questions that drive so much of the content that we make here. Thanks for joining me. I will see all of you tomorrow.